are fortunate to have this morning with us Ralph Peters. Ralph Peters is a writer, strategist, commentator, and retired military officer. Since 2009, he has also served as Fox News' strategic analyst. He is the author of 28 books and nearly 1,000 columns, articles, essays, and reviews. Uniform service, personal interests, and research have taken him to not less than 70 countries and 6 continents. He served in the United States Army for 22 years, retiring as a lieutenant colonel. He served in the executive office of the president. He lived in Europe for a total of 10 years and reported from various conflict zones, including Iraq, Israel, and sub-Saharan Africa. It will be worthwhile to mention just a few of the 28 books. 7 books on strategy and military affairs, including Wars of Blood and Faith, Beyond Baghdad, Beyond Terror, and Fighting for the Future, and New Glory, Expanding America's Global Supremacy, a non-partisan critique of our national strategy. He also published a memoir, Looking for Trouble, and several novels, including the latest, which is a frightening one for this audience, The War After Armageddon, which takes the United States Armed Forces back to the Middle East after a nuclear destruction of Israel. His topic is an interesting one, Israel's Crime, Success. Ralph Peters.
Israel's survival and remarkable success is a terrible, degrading embarrassment. It is obviously not an embarrassment to Israelis, nor is it an embarrassment to most Americans. But it is a grave and enduring embarrassment to 3 influential groups that influence how Israel's perceived in the media and in the world. And before I speak specifically about my rather alternative take on journalism and journalists, I want to speak about those 3 groups. They are Europeans, Arabs and other Muslims in the greater Middle East, and the global left. Now, first with Europeans. Europeans really didn't dislike the Holocaust. They disliked getting caught. There were, outside of Denmark, I know of few mass demonstrations to defend the Jews as they were deported to death camps. There were few legal cases brought to protect Jewish property. Rather, there was a scramble for it, as you know. Well, Jews had the terrible bad manners to survive. And not only to survive, but those who came to Israel built the remarkable state in which I am privileged to speak today. As a result, Europeans are forced to be ashamed, but more important than the shame, they are resentful of the shame they feel. Which brings me to a classic example, the great Janeane massacre. When the first reports of that terrible butchery at Janeane came out, Europeans were gleeful, delighted, because Europeans desperately, and I'm speaking of continental Europeans, they desperately need you to be evil. They need you to be as evil as they were. And for Europeans grasping for moral equivalence, Janeane canceled Auschwitz. The second group, the Arabs and other Muslims of the greater Middle East. Of course, we all know the classic example of Israel taking land that was fallow for 1,000 years, perhaps 2 millennia, and turning it into something that's fertile, not merely in the classic orange groves and olive grove sense, but in a complex dedicated to nanotechnology. At the same time, the Arab civilization of the Middle East confronts us with its comprehensive failure. How can they not be resentful? Your Arab neighbors in the year 2011 not only cannot design and build a decent automobile, they cannot build a competitive bicycle. They are not competitive in any significant sphere of human endeavor, not even terrorism, because we are terrorizing the terrorists. Now, I also want to say that we are also often so careless with our language and our metaphors and examples. We'll often hear that, well, the Arab world and Arab Islam is caught in the Dark Ages. Well, that's not so. In fact, the parallel is with the High Middle Ages in the West. The 13th century, when the Christian world froze into arcane theological discussions that led nowhere. The Arab world today has Thomas Aquinas over and over again, but they're still far from Galileo, which is why, as an aside, as frightening as some manifestations of the Arab awakening may be, I see it as a last desperate hope. Now, the third group that is profoundly, helplessly anti-Israel is, of course, the global left, which is paradoxical because, of course, in the beginning, we're the socialists in Israel. And the kibbutzes were really not Fox News watchers, had there been a Fox News back then to watch. But what you have done cruelly to the global left is you destroyed, or certainly assaulted, a crucial myth. The myth that underdeveloped countries, developing peoples, cannot get ahead because the West will always keep them down. In historical terms, Israel's progress has been without precedent. It has been meteoric. And the only refuge left to the global left is to indulge in the astonishingly unchallenged racism in which it indulges. Now, we heard in the first fine series of presentations this morning, issues of responsibility raised stole some of my thunder because I always hear about universal human rights, and by God, I believe in them. But with rights, and I believe before rights, come responsibilities. Where is the discussion of universal human responsibilities? The responsibility not to kill the innocent in terrorist attacks. The responsibility not to preach the annihilation of your neighbors. The responsibility to treat your own people, and especially the female half of humanity, with some elementary decency. Now, I spoke of racism, and there clearly is a sliding scale applied to behavior, standards, sliding scale of standards. And frankly, the whiter you are, the better the left expects you to behave. As you go on the sliding scale from tan to brown to black, you increasingly get a pass for atrocities. Now that is racism. The left's neo-imperialist attitude is the postmodern version of the old Little Brown Brothers imperialism, where Palestinians and other Arabs who support terror and other non-Arabs who support terror get a pass because, well, they're not really mature. What you see in the left with their indulgence of terror in sub-Saharan Africa and the Middle East and elsewhere, what you are seeing is to me, just an appalling form of Hitler's theory of Untermenschen. The idea that they are not really fully human yet. How can we allow this to pass and go unchallenged? How can we tolerate one standard applied to states such as Israel and the United States, the UK, Australia, and Canada that struggle to be just, that risk the lives of their own people and their own soldiers to do what is morally correct even in wartime? And yet, see the global left championing champion Hamas, Hezbollah, Lashkar-e-Taiba, and others as freedom fighters. What freedom are they fighting for? So I move with that to part two, journalists. I'm an accidental journalist. I never planned to be one. I didn't. I mean, it was far, it just happened, folks. And it was not a love match. But yes, and I married the enemy. I married a journalist. And so I must preface these remarks by saying I am under no illusions. We need a free press, a free media for our democracies to survive. It's an absolute requirement. But again, with freedom comes responsibility. And the fundamental responsibility of journalists, reporters, is to try to get at the facts as best they can be ascertained, as uncomfortable as those facts may be. Now, opinion columns are something else. Talk shows are something else. But basic reporting must strive, to the extent humanly possible, for honesty. So that's the preface. But journalists I have known and loved, some are right-wing, many try to be objective, but I think there's no question that globally the majority veer left. To different degrees, there's just no question about it. I mean, human beings self-segregate. Look at the state of Israel. There just aren't a whole lot of large Methodist communities among you. Certain types of people join certain religious subgroups. Certain types of people choose careers in the army. Others choose careers in social work. And some choose careers in journalism. Now, the key to understanding journalists is this. Journalists are herd animals who see themselves as rugged individualists. They are wolves who imagine themselves as eagles. And to stay with the animal metaphor just a bit longer, the pilot fish, whenever any dramatic event happens anywhere in the world, the pilot fish, the New York Times, BBC, a few key agencies decide what the narrative will be. And everyone else, or nearly everyone else, follows that. And yes, reporters want scoops, but they want scoops within the parameters of the narrative. To me, the classic example is 2006, when I was a very lonely reporter up at Kibbutz Sasa. There was, I saw, when the days I was up there, I saw one other journalist come for a quick in and out to get a dateline. Because the narrative had been established as Lebanese suffering. And there was virtually no interest in over 100,000 displaced Israelis living in bomb shelters for a month. Destruction. It was hard to get that story out. And it did get out, but it wasn't front page. Because the story was the baby in Lebanese Kana that died 500 times. And that's another crucial point. As you move forward, you've got to understand that not only is there a narrative set, but also increasingly images dominate. Every major world event comes down to one dominant image. And the images that came out, we had that dead baby from Lebanon, even though it turned out to be a fake shot done over and over again, that was the defining narrative. Now, I said journalists self-segregate. And there's one other thing I have to say. The journalists need to get their egos under control. Not anybody here, of course. But journalists need to get a little perspective. Journalists live off the deeds of others, off the suffering and successes of others. Without the dead baby, there's no story. Now, I think when you live off the actions, the failures, the triumphs of other men and women who actually do things, a bit of humility is in order. But we have moved on to the age of celebrity journalism. Not the 1950s celebrity journalism that had Elizabeth Taylor covered by a journalist. I mean, poor Elizabeth Taylor, always a bridesmaid, never a bride. I mean, always a bride, never a bridesmaid. But now it's journalists who are celebrities. And I saw this change in my lifetime, and it's very painful, because in the golden age of U.S. journalism, from the 1920s into the 1950s, Dorothy Parker and Lillian Ross, really, through Edward R. Murrow, journalism was at best a dirty white-collar profession, for many a light blue-collar profession. Relatively few journalists had college degrees. They knew the people about whom they wrote. We had great journalism in World War II because Ernie Pyle, Richard Tergascus, these journalists, whether or not they'd served in the military themselves, they lived with the troops, not for a short embed, they lived with the troops through campaigns, and they had grown up in the same neighborhoods. But increasingly in the United States, to work for the elite media, you must have an Ivy League degree from a journalism school. Increasingly, at the better publications, the elite publications, you start out doing an unpaid internship. How many working class families can send their kids on unpaid internships? So increasingly, elite journalism in the better outlets becomes an elite pursuit by people who really think they know better, who think they are entitled to determine the course of the country, and who, frankly, in my view, have relatively little respect for democracy, because democracy is made by the common man and woman. Well, at any rate, we need journalists, but journalists, too, have to be held to account. Who watches the watchers? I would like journalists to be more self-policing. Now, just to quickly wrap up, because I want to leave some time for questions, and I think it's a good idea to come in under time, I also believe that in addition to criticizing, you have to offer solutions. And I can't go into detail on this, but having seen Israel's, the IDF's difficulties in the 2006 war, I would say you need to pursue a 3 E's approach, which is engage, embarrass, and excel. Engage. You've got to engage the world media and put through the rebuffs. Just keep engaging them. Get them in here. Pay attention to them. Flatter the big egos. Do what you have to do. Israel, in its foundational years, was brilliant at propaganda. And I use that not in a pejorative sense, but in a positive sense. Information aimed at achieving a certain cause. You know, as a young Methodist, later Episcopalian, growing up in Pennsylvania, in the coal fields of Pennsylvania, in the 1950s and 60s, I knew that all Jews looked like, all Israelis looked like Paul Newman. And that all good Jewish girls were thin and had gorgeous long blonde hair. I mean, and actually they're pretty gorgeous. But at any rate, I mean, Israel subsidized Leon Uris when he was writing the book Exodus. And it was brilliant because it wasn't aimed at elites, it was aimed at the average voting citizen. I mean, Paul Newman, what a brilliant casting job, those blue eyes. And then Kirk Douglas as Mickey Marcus. You engage the population through a media form that entranced them with stories, with narratives. And now increasingly, when Israel does engage, it engages the elites. You've got to go for the voters. So engage, embarrass. When there's a Janeane type story, humiliate. Publicly go after the people that tell the lies. Go after them relentlessly. And finally, the one thing that Israel, I think, will always do, excel. Because your success has generated so much jealousy and so much hatred that you will always face enemies. Hopefully you can reduce the number. But the one thing you can do is what Israel has done since its foundation years, and that is to excel. So, in conclusion, and when I say in conclusion, I mean in conclusion. In conclusion, it is my fervent hope and prayer that when all of us in this audience are dust, when our children have turned to dust and their children's children have turned to dust, there will still be a vibrant, thriving, free Israel. Thank you.